Hello, students. Welcome back to our next lesson on the longest topic of the year, geologic time. Yesterday, you may recall that we talked about how geologic time is divided up, and we also began discussing the first era of geologic time, the Precambrian era. Well, today we're going to pick up where we left off by discussing the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic eras of geologic time. And if you listen to all three of those terms, you probably heard what was common among them, zoic. Zoic refers to living things. So we're going to begin exploring today the three major eras of time where there were major explosions of living things that began to appear in the fossil record here on planet Earth. So without further ado, let's begin with our first one, the Paleozoic Era. The Paleozoic Era, as you can see here, extended from where we left off yesterday at 570 MYA. What does MYA stand for? Million years ago, all the way up to 225 million years ago. And as we discuss the Paleozoic Era, remember from yesterday how we mentioned that eras are kind of like the seasons of the Earth's history, and periods are kind of like more specific months within those seasons. So today we're going to be exploring some of the periods of the Paleozoic Era. In fact, the Paleozoic Era is divided into 6 different periods based on the major events that we can see through the fossil record. These major events all have to do with very significant changes in the life forms existing on planet Earth. And of course, we know that through what remains today in the fossil record, of which we learned last week. So let's begin with the first period of the Paleozoic Era, which is called the Cambrian period. By the way, when you look at that word Cambrian, does it remind you of anything from yesterday? What was the first era that we discussed yesterday? It was the Precambrian. The prefix pre means before something. So the Precambrian era came before the Cambrian period of the Paleozoic era. All right, nonetheless, during the Cambrian era of the Paleozoic era, we see evidence today in the fossil record in these rock layers, the very first sea-dwelling invertebrates. Now, an invertebrate is an organism without a backbone. So we see the very first fossils of sea-dwelling invertebrates during what we call the Cambrian period of the Paleozoic era. These were the major life forms that we see in these rock layers around the world. Now, this is followed by the Ordovician. Look at that word and say it with me, please. Ordovician. During the Ordovician period of the Paleozoic era, the very first fishies appear. By the way, I hope you are appreciating my painstakingly detailed diagrams of living things that I am drawing for you for your notes. So be sure to take advantage of that when you are copying your notes in your book. You can feel free to add these little diagrams next to your notes too, if you'd like, although it may take you quite a bit of time. Nonetheless, the Ordovician period of the Paleozoic era is when the very first fish appear in the fossil record. So we know that during this time of Earth's history, there were a lot of these types of organisms swimming around in the seas and the oceans of the early planet Earth. These were the dominant life forms. Now, the Ordovician period was followed by the Silurian. In fact, look at that word and say it with me, Silurian. During the Silurian period of the Paleozoic era, we see major evidence of our very first land plants existing on Earth. Last week, when we were studying fossils, the imprint fossil I showed you was of land plants, more specifically ferns, that existed. These are the types of organisms that dominate the fossil record, and so we can speculate that these were the dominant life forms that existed during the Silurian period of the Paleozoic era. This is followed by the Devonian, a very exciting time in Earth's history. And remember, all of these periods are kind of like major snapshots of significant events that have taken place over Earth's history, just like snapshots in a photo album of you growing up from one major event to another major event in your lives. But the Devonian period is when the first amphibians appeared on the surface of the Earth, and our first forests began to appear. So in the fossil record, we see evidence of amphibians and forests existing during the Devonian period. Now, the Devonian period was followed by probably one of the, how shall I say it, the most utilized period of the Paleozoic era. This is called the Carboniferous period. In fact, look at that word and say it with me, Carboniferous. The Carboniferous period was dominated by the existence of swamps, ferns, insects, and reptiles. Lots of critters existed on the Earth at this time, and it's during the Carboniferous period where many of our present fossil fuels come from. Have you heard of things like our carbon footprint in the news in recent years? Well, we have been for a couple hundred years now extracting fossil fuels that began forming during the Carboniferous period. Things that we use today include coal and natural gas and oil. These are all products from the Carboniferous period of the Paleozoic era. And as we extract them and burn them, it produces byproducts such as carbon dioxide. And these fossil fuels are rich in carbon, which is the fuel that we can burn so easily. So even though we're talking about something that happened in the fossil record millions and millions of years, hundreds of millions of years ago, we are utilizing these carbon fossil fuels today, and it's huge in the news because we are releasing such enormous quantities of carbon dioxide gas from the Carboniferous period of the Paleozoic era. More on that topic later. But after the Carboniferous period comes the Permian period. And during the Permian period, there were not only lots of reptiles like snakes and turtles, but there were also conifers, a specific type of tree. And we can see in the fossil record that conifer trees dominated the landscape at this point in Earth's history. So, a quick review, we've got the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and the Permian. These are the 6 periods of the Paleozoic era. Now, I am going to ask you to memorize the correct order of these 6 periods. But I never ask you to memorize something without trying to give you a little help. So I'm giving you a little picture in your book, and here's the little picture here as well. And if you go through these notes, if you check your notes uh, prior to the lab activity and make sure you've completed them. If you go through these notes, you'll actually hear some sound effects that I've added. You see the little speaker there. There are some sound effects. I wonder if it'll work right now. Let's see if we can listen. No, I guess not. You have to actually play it. But I'll leave it up to you to play around with the presentation here to see if you can hear the pig oinking as the pig calls someone over the fence. In fact, you can see the name of this pig. It's DC Pig. All right. And DC Pig is saying, "Come over," said DC Pig. Now, why am I giving you such a silly little sentence? Well, think about it. You can probably look at that picture and remember that DC Pig is saying, "Come over," said DC Pig. And that is just a ridiculous sentence. And in science and in other topics as well, you can oftentimes come up with a silly little sentence that you can remember very easily, like "come over," said DC Pig. And if you look at the first letter of each word in that silly little sentence, that should give you a hint as to why that might be an effective memory aid. Hey, if it doesn't help you, you can come up with your own silly little sentence, but I like "come over," said DC Pig, to remember Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian, the 6 periods of the Paleozoic Era. So that brings us to the next era, the Mesozoic Era. Now, the prefix meso means middle. And so during the Mesozoic Era, which takes place between 225 million years ago and 65 million years ago, and by the way, we're going to be talking about a major event at the end of the Mesozoic Era, but there's a whole new group of life forms that we see evident in the fossil record during the Mesozoic Era. And so let's discuss the various periods of the Mesozoic Era, starting with the Triassic. During the Triassic period, the very first dinosaurs appear on our planet, as well as the first mammals. Now, we're not talking about big mammals and we're not talking about big dinosaurs at this point, at least, but the Triassic period has the first dinosaurs, little critters, little dinosaurs like this one, and small mammals, kind of like along the size range of like moles and voles and mice, little mammals. And we see evidence of those in the fossil record. This is followed by probably the most famous geologic period of all. Why is it the most famous? Well, who doesn't love dinosaurs, right? And who hasn't seen the movies of Jurassic Park and Jurassic World? One of the most popular movie series of the last 50 years. Well, it's during the Jurassic period of the Mesozoic era that the first birds appear, but more predominantly, and these are the types of fossils everybody looks for, the dinosaurs, the big dinosaurs, like the Hadrosaurus, found here first in the state of New Jersey. Or recently, they've also uncovered some more Tyrannosaurus dinosaur fossils in our country. But when you hear on the news of fossils being found, they are more than likely dinosaur fossils from the Jurassic period of the Mesozoic era, because these are the largest, most significant, and sometimes the scariest fossils that we can find in the fossil record. So, probably the most famous period, the Jurassic period of the Mesozoic era. But it doesn't end there because we go on to the Cretaceous. The Cretaceous period is when the first flowers appear in the fossil record. How pretty. Yeah. Flowers first appeared during the Cretaceous period, and the dinosaurs die out. And the dinosaurs die out because of a major event we're going to be talking about in just a moment. But before we get to that, let's review the three periods of the Mesozoic era: Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And again, I'm going to ask you to memorize the correct order of these periods of the Mesozoic era. And here is a memory aid for you. Can you picture this? A tiger juggling chainsaws. Now, I think I'd pay money to see that in a circus. A tiger juggling chainsaws, although I would want to be at a safe distance, of course. But look at the first letter of each word and you will see TJC. TJC. You can probably come up with your own memory aid, TJC, but Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods of the Mesozoic era. But let's continue because this is an exciting theory that has existed for about the last 40, 50, 60 years or so. And this extinction theory has now been supported by a lot of evidence which has been found over the years. But this extinction theory, which we're going to discuss now, helps to explain this mass extinctions. In fact, the Earth has experienced a number of mass extinctions over its history, but this is probably the most famous and most significant, where more than 3/4 of Earth's living things died out during this particular time frame in our geologic history. And this extinction theory was proposed by a father and a son by the names of Walter and Louis Alvarez. Walter and Louis Alvarez, a father and son team, both geologists. And these geologists, this father and son geologist, and here's a picture of them right now, looking at a cross section that exists between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic eras of geologic time. This is a boundary zone, which is called the CT boundary. And we'll see in a moment why it's called, well, I can tell you right now why it's called the CT boundary. It's a layer of radioactive sediment that has extraterrestrial origins. What does that mean? It means it came from outer space. Ooh, yeah. And it's found between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary periods. Now, we've learned about the Tertiary period of the Mesozoic era, and just in a few moments we'll learn about the Cretaceous period of the Cenozoic era. But between these two periods, or in other words, between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic eras, there is this boundary zone. And Walter and Louis Alvarez made a prediction. They hypothesized that this radioactive sediment that they discovered in various places around the world was due to an asteroid collision. That's right. A huge asteroid from outer space slammed into planet Earth and spewed out this massive amount of material, which settled down around the entire planet in this sedimentary layer, which was radioactive between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary periods of Earth history. It is, in fact, believed today and widely accepted that this asteroid, pictured here by an artist, this is not an actual photograph. No humans existed back then, at least not on planet Earth. But it's believed that this asteroid landed in what is now known as the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, near the Gulf of Mexico. And there have been studies done, and a lot of evidence certainly suggests that there is a large crater under the Gulf of Mexico, near the Yucatan Peninsula, that illustrates, shows, demonstrates, and provides evidence of the origin of this radioactive sedimentary layer around the Earth. And through various computer modeling studies, it is widely accepted today that this asteroid collision about 65 million years ago is what caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs became extinct at this same period of time as we see this evidence of this radioactive sediment from outer space due to an asteroid collision. It is a logical assumption to make that this asteroid collision was at least a major component to the reason why the dinos went extinct. And so it is sad to say that all of our dinosaur friends are dead. But not all life ceased to exist, because we have another era of geologic time called the Cenozoic Era. I mean, after all, we're here. Not that we existed 65 million years ago, but we're here. So all life didn't stop at this point in time. But the Cenozoic Era extends from 65 million years ago, where we left off with the Mesozoic, to the present time. And of course, this era is divided into periods as well, beginning with the Tertiary period. Remember that CT boundary? Here's the Tertiary period. And during the Tertiary period of the Cenozoic Era, mammals exploded on planet Earth. When we look at the fossil record during the Tertiary period, we have a predominance of mammals existing with present day features. And in other words, the mammals during this period look like mammals today, with some notable exceptions of extinct mammals like, saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths and things like that no longer exist. Now, during the next period, called the Quaternary period of the Cenozoic Era, we consider the most significant period of all, because it's when we arrived on the scene. So modern humans and the ice ages, for instance, are part of the fossil record of the Quaternary period of the Cenozoic Era. And so there we have it, a quick tour of the four major eras and the various periods of geologic time. And so we're going to be preparing for tomorrow's lab, which will help us visualize just the span of time during geologic time and how these major events are spaced out through geologic time. That's what tomorrow's lab activity is going to be all about. We're going to be creating a timeline of Earth's history. But until then, I'm going to say, for now, Bye bye.